Now, when we act, there is an anatomy of a human act. In other words, there are things that make a difference as to why we act. The three things, if you look at your schedule here, are the object of the act. The object of the act is the effect, is the subject matter. The next is the circumstances, which sometimes make a difference, sometimes doesn't make a difference. And of course, the intention. The intention is the end. If any one of these three are immoral, the act is immoral. So let me give you an example. The object of an abortion, for instance, which is an intrinsic evil, which we will get to in a second, is the object of the act is abortion. The circumstance could be, this is a young woman who cannot take care of a baby. The intention is that two people don't suffer because of this one mistake. The problem with that, and this is called proportionalism, the problem with that is that the object, which is the abortion, is evil, which renders the human act evil. And there's no way you can make this any better. So the object of the act has to be moral. The intention has to be moral in order for it to be a moral act. Now, when we talk about a human act, two things have to happen. There's a thing called an act of man. And what an act of man is this. I'm walking. Oh, sorry. I'm walking. I don't really care one way or the other. I'm breathing. I'm eating. Those are not moral questions. Those are called acts of man. But a moral question has to have two components. The first component is there has to be what's called a knowledge of the object. So an intellectual sense. So I have to know what exactly I am doing. If I don't, it's not a moral act. And the second thing is I have to be free to do it. So let me give you an example in this situation. Let's say, for instance, the young man is sleeping and he has teenage boys. He believes everybody's in bed. He hears a commotion in the kitchen, gets up, pulls out a revolver, shoots his son, he finds out. What would that be? And the lack of. The lack would be the object. He didn't know this was his son. So the object has to be known in order for it to be a moral act, and you have to freely will it. Both of those have to be into place. Now there's a couple of things that come into this sense of how we act. We have to know the object and we have to be able to freely do it. But sometimes something comes up. So there are a couple of ways in which it lessens the culpability of the moral act. And that is specifically what's called ignorance. There are two types. There is complete error, which someone might be in complete error. The culpability is lessened. Or there is ignorance. And they are divided into two things: vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. What vincible ignorance is in which I choose not to know the object so well. I choose not to know it. So for instance, if I knew that murder was wrong, if I chose not to find out that that was a sin, a mortal sin, and that was bad, I would be vincibly ignorant. I would still be culpable for the act because I could have changed it. And then there is what's called invincible ignorance, in which the culpability is not completely exonerated, but it is lessened. And that is when I have tried in every way possible to listen, to read, to study about something, and for whatever reason, I still cannot believe it. So, some people it may be varying things. It could be something like divorce or something, I don't know. But it could be that I've tried everything in my power and I still don't believe that this is the truth. That's invincible ignorance. That limits what a human person can do in that act. Now, if you flip the page, the next part is conscience. Now, there's two main things I want to talk about in conscience. One of them is, as Vatican II says, it is this inner secret core in which we are alone with God. This is for every human being. John Henry Newman once said that the conscience is the aboriginal. That means that there's nothing that comes in the place of Jesus in us, in which God is completely there in dialogue with us. A healthy conscience does two things. It first of all weighs whether or not an action is moral or it is immoral, and whether it is right or whether it is wrong. Once we have acted, if we have acted rightly, the conscience has done its job. if we have not acted correctly, the conscience will then turn on us and indict us. And that's what's called the guilty conscience. Now what happens sometimes? What happens is that through a repetition of a sinful or wrong activity, that faculty of the conscience becomes deadened. And so that it is no longer capable of being able to determine right or wrong, nor does it indict the person who commits wrong. The person has so deadened it, and that's of course in Gaudium et Spes as well. It has deadened so because of the habitualness of sin that it no longer can tell what is good and what is evil. So the conscience is a very important thing, but it must be formed. It must be formed in the way of truth, and it must be constantly looked upon and fostered so that it can be that guide for moral law for us.